Steve, great to have you here. Steve is the founder and owner-operator of Eastcut Sandwich Bar. They have two locations, one in Durham and one in Raleigh. And today we're going to go behind the scenes of what it takes to start and run a sandwich bar. So thanks for being here, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You did not grow up in the Raleigh-Durham area, and you have an interesting journey into small business ownership. You spent some time in consulting, I think most recently at Philips. So why don't you kind of give us a 101 on your journey to owning a small business?
Yeah, no, it's definitely not the prototypical raceway to restaurant ownership, but grew up in New York, worked in healthcare, finance, pivoted to consulting, and did a lot of travel, kind of see all kinds of places over the country. And in 2015, moved to the Durham area with my wife, who was going to graduate school at Duke. We fell in love with the area. And after the 2 years were up, we were trying to figure out, what do we want to do? One of our friends was one of her classmates, and he and I got together over lots of beers. We're talking about different businesses, and his background was actually in the restaurant industry, and as well as in kind of the corporate marketing space for that. And, we looked at the Durham market, and we were like, man, there's not really like a good sandwich spot down here. And so a really interesting, story on how we got to get the first location. So, we designed the concept, we spun up, the financial models, the business plan, we started the real estate hunt, and that process takes an insane amount of time, and it still does as we continue to grow the concept.
Big bottleneck to additional locations?
Yeah. And it's become more so now. But our first location, we searched a bunch of places. We had brokers helping us, but coincidentally, we actually also were working with a business broker, and he actually had a bunch of listings, and one of them ended up being a restaurant in Durham.
And was it operational at the time?
It was operational. Their kind of backstory was that they originally were a restaurant in Raleigh. And at that time, the Department of Transportation needed to build some sort of highway access ramp or something. It's like kind of the classic, eminent domain story. And so they got bought out by the highway department or whoever, got a bunch of money, and they relocated their whole operation to Durham, which is about 40 minutes away.
Yeah.
Bought a property, bought a pre-existing building, which used to be a garden center. So it had like a greenhouse, a kind of freestanding building, a big parking lot. They converted that whole thing to a restaurant with the kind of sole intention actually of retiring and being essentially landlords. So fortuitous timing for us. It needs some cosmetic work, but infrastructurally, they had put all brand new equipment, electric, HVAC, the hoods, all the things that you really need to spend crazy amounts of money on. And we were able to kind of negotiate a very decent acquisition.
That's really cool. And so was it structured as like both you leasing the property from those owners and like an asset purchase?
Yeah, an asset purchase agreement for essentially for the business. We kind of bought the business, bought the equipment that was included in it, and then they retained kind of ownership of the building. And so we're still leasing from them today.
It's a really interesting way to get started.
Yeah, so that was kind of our first store. Opened that in 2018 in Durham. It's definitely I think helped us kind of build our brand and position uniquely in the Durham market.
That's really cool. Here in Austin, there are a number of flagships like that where it's a house that is a restaurant now. So definitely is a more homey kind of inviting vibe inside. So you close on the acquisition and lease agreement. What are the big to-dos to get operational?
So the biggest thing we're doing was a lot of cosmetic work and some equipment changes and layout. So we, thankfully at this specific one, we didn't need to work with an architect, but typically you're going to want an architect kind of draw up plans, have a really good GC. We spent a lot of that year leading up, honestly, just meeting with every commercial contractor and even architects in our market to kind of get to know them. So we knew who's going to be on that team. We needed to secure, funding from our friends, family, and fools investor cohort. So we pulled that together. Once you're done with construction, you're working with the health department essentially, and obviously building permits, all that stuff. And then the health department is you kind of, as everything's finally set up and ready to go, you've got, your preliminary health inspections. They run through the whole facility. And the first one we did, it was very intense. They were literally pulling apart, the walls. They're like, there's not enough caulk over here. You got to patch that back up. They were
No way.
very intense about it, which was great. It really helped us kind of understand, okay, what are all the things that you need to look at? Because you have never done this before. So they were actually very helpful. It was also like intense. You're like, wow, they're looking at like everything. So once you pass that, they give you kind of a preliminary piece. And, alongside that, a lot of this was happening in parallel, but you're setting up all of the technology infrastructure, point of sale, and then starting recruiting. So we had, intentionally hired kind of a manager at the time to help us mostly on the kitchen operations side a couple of months before opening. And then we were just doing power, massive interview days for the first couple of weeks before we got open. Just getting, whoever would be willing to join an upstart restaurant. It took some time to really kind of gain our footing. The first few months, I would say like the first 6 months of any restaurant upstart in particular are very rocky. Like you haven't established yourself. You haven't established kind of your regulars cadence, your menu structure. I mean, we would literally change the layout of our dining room, like literally pulling pieces out overnight, like restructuring the flow like 6 times over in the middle of the night as we were kind of figuring out like, how does this work? A lot of change happens very rapidly at those the beginning stages.
How'd y'all experiment with what to put on the menu?
I think that we get better and better at this over time, but the goal is always to kind of structure the menu in a way that you maximize kind of cross utilization of ingredients across the menu, but also make it like exciting and interesting for guests.
Sure.
So we certainly had some big ambitions going in. Everything was scratch made to like maybe like an overly extreme point where it was very complicated to prep at volume and scale. We were just like digging ourselves into like a hole of like, wow, we're doing like 40,000 different businesses in this one sandwich shop that's 2,000 square feet. So we really need to kind of focus on refining that. So, over time, and we continue this process today, we have someone who's actually kind of the point person on product development and innovation. We're always looking critically at our, the prep lists, our inventory, kind of minimizing the SKUs we have. And then even on the menu, like using really nice ingredients and fresh ingredients. And we still do a lot of stuff in-house and scratch made that you wouldn't typically see. Like we pull all the mozzarella in-house. We make our own mozzarella sticks.
Oh, wow.
All the chicken that we sell a ridiculous amount of is hand cleaned, breaded, made in-house. All of our sauces are made in-house. We still do quite a bit of prep, but it's much simpler as we've gone over time because we started to realize like in our bracket too, you're not necessarily going to attract like a chef de cuisine from they're just different categories of folks. So we wanted to make sure that it was available to people with different skill sets. We really focused on like streamlining a lot of those processes and making it simpler and simpler, but still tasting really good.
Got it. And so the big hack with designing a menu is you want something that is unique, attracts customers, but also is simple and uses enough common ingredients that your inventory isn't going crazy.
Exactly.
What is the supplier relationships? What does that look like for a restaurant of your size?
There's a handful of what we call broadliners, that kind of the primary, commodity level suppliers that you'd see out there, like US Foods, Cisco, Performance Foods, and a few others. They'll carry the bulk of stuff for us. When we first started, we had, separate vendors for a lot of it. And we tried to really focus on like minimizing those. And we've kind of actually started adding back a few just because you run the risk if you over consolidate of being stuck with either a vendor's operational issues or their pricing differentiation that starts to really to stand out. You can typically work on arrangements with kind of especially the larger wholesalers about, essentially like, rebates and like a common percentage savings that you'd see across all orders as long as you hit certain volume thresholds.
Got it. And so kind of putting all this together, I come in, I order a Dagwood with curly fries or something like that. And it comes out to around $17. What do the margins look like on that order? Like where is that typically going to on a percentage basis?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for us, there's kind of a few categories of what we call prime cost. The goal for us is to really have a prime cost, or essentially, your gross margin of 65%. So it'd be 35% gross margin. So 28 to 30% of that is just the cost of the food.
Okay. Like from those suppliers and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. So like if you're making the Dagwood, for instance, you've got turkey, you've got the bread that it's on, you've got the Swiss cheese, lettuce, tomato, bacon, and then the sauce that goes on there as well. And then tomato, obviously. And so all of those, you stack all those up, you try to target our pricing and the cost of the portions that we use to around that 28% target or so. So it's kind of an inverse. You take your cost, divide it out by the 28%, you get essentially your menu price for that item. But amongst all that, you've got obviously your variable labor, so your front of house, back of house folks, and then your management team labor costs as well. And then there is also sort of the paper component to that, so the thing that it gets wrapped in and packaged in. So with all of those kind of those variable costs in that item, we really try to hit a broad prime cost of 65% or below, and we typically range between 60 65, depending on pricing volatility in the market too, which we've seen a lot of over the past few years.
Sure. And so you'll factor in like the cost of management into the COGS for a given item.
Yeah, pretty much, because it's obviously a fixed cost structure for us, but we need to factor it in to make sure that the all-in operation can sustain itself, and really that like 60% threshold is kind of like critical, because you still have all the other operating costs to go into the business. So and
what are the big ones there? Like rent, I imagine
rent's a huge one. Typically 8% or so for us, or under, ideally.
8% top line?
Yeah, 8% of sales. So, and then, you've got your insurance and marketing and a lot of facility work, so repairs and maintenance.
Yeah.
Things break a lot in the restaurant space, so equipment just gets abused.
Yeah. And so you get the first one in Durham live, you go through a lot of these learnings on how to do supply, how to lay out the restaurant, whatnot. What gave you the confidence of like, hey, we're ready to do location 2?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time to, preliminary to opening, and as we open, to really like systemizing like everything. So we have checklists for checklists, basically, upon checklist. So we really kind of focused on making sure that we felt good about operations, the menu mix, profitability. It took us 6 months essentially to break even, and then from there we did very well up until March of 2020. So we were actually we were like, we're ready to press go. We started actually negotiating an LOI for a second location in Raleigh. We essentially were going to be signing it and meeting with the landlord there on March 13th of 2020. And that meeting obviously got postponed.
Sure.
And that whole second location got quite delayed, ended up going somewhere else entirely. But, we at the time felt very confident, but I felt, COVID in some ways really helped us refine the business in a lot of respects.
So we're sitting here almost at the end of the first quarter of 2025. What are the big goals for Eastcut over the next year?
We are actually currently negotiating the final stages of a lease for a third location. So we really would love to get that one operational, hopefully by the end of the year. So really want to get that other location started with our 2 existing. It's kind of at this point
also in the triangle.
Yeah, so it'd be probably somewhere in between Raleigh or Durham.
Well, awesome, Steve. Thanks so much for coming on. And next time I'm back home in North Carolina, I'm looking forward to having a sandwich with you guys.